Hello, everybody. Welcome to SoCal Looper, and thank you for joining. I think you will be really fascinated by what you hear today. So we have Tim Street, who has type 1 diabetes, and he writes an amazing blog called Diabettech, and I've been following it for years. He very meticulously does reviews, and I always check on him before I look at any new technology. So we're going to go on to our normal disclaimer. The Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm, and while it may seem obvious, please consult your healthcare professionals regarding your diabetes management. Important, please understand that this project is highly experimental and is not US FDA approved for therapy. Therefore, you take full responsibility for building and running this system, and you do so at your own risk. Okay, here we go. Strong recommendations from SoCal Loopers to all loopers. If you are looping happily, and I'm assuming most of you are, it's a great idea to check in to SoCal Loopers for critical updates and information, such as iOS updates, when you should do it and when you shouldn't, time change issues, etc. It's helpful, and so please set your Facebook SoCal Loopers notification to highlights. That will allow any mentions of you to show up in your notifications, and also any important announcements. So I'm going to talk a little bit before we go on to the main events today, and I want to take in a moment of appreciation. I am continually amazed at the energy, the time, the kindness, the technical knowledge, and the efforts of our community, and in particular, the admins for SoCal Loopers. Behind the scenes, these folks answer posts, they help, they mentor loopers, they troubleshoot loop issues, they post solutions and alerts, they try to help with improvements to loop docs, they share their knowledge on looping and eating and apps and way more. We're all so much better for having this community with these folks. So I'll just shout them out, and they're not all on today, but Kenny Fox, Mark Oldham, Glenn Weber, Carol Vachon, Priscilla Fogel, Sarah Goya, and Cassidy Robinson. An amazing group. They're all admins on this group because we think you deserve a whole lot of attention, and that's what we do the best we can. And one final note, please. Sorry about that. Our world and our country has been in an extraordinary turmoil. Not my dog, but I want to thank you all on SoCal Loopers for keeping your posts on topic and avoiding personal opinions or frustrations in our group. We look forward to calmness, to a return to normal life. Just thank you for helping us maintain a good place to share about loop and life with looping and diabetes. Very much appreciate that. So we're going to start off today. I'm going to tell you about all our speakers, and then we will start with one. Tim Street writes, as I mentioned, a blog called diabettech.com. I've posted that several times. And as he says, he's a technophile who thinks like an engineer and walks the walk as a type 1 diabetic. In his blog, he discusses both diabetes and technology to try and determine what is really the, quote, art of the possible. I have loved his reviews on Lyumjev and Fiasp, all the closed loop systems and CGMs, including the new Abbott Libre 3, which isn't available in the US, but it's available in the market in Europe. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or wherever you are. Tim, I'm going to turn this over to you, but I'm going to start with one question that I haven't normally been asking, but could you just tell us briefly a little bit about your journey with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was diagnosed in 1988, so it's quite a long time ago now. Back in the days of twice daily insulin, when we were put on NPH as the standard and you ate to your insulin, and then went on to the early MDI, where it was regular and NPH as your two different types of insulin, which was sometimes a challenge and still required quite a bit of eating to your insulin. One of those things, unfortunately, as I'm sure other people on here remember. I managed to find some of but they moved all of our doctors' records online a couple of years ago, and I managed to find some from back in 1991 and 1992. And I was immensely surprised to find that my HbA1c number at the time was 6.3%, which I was which I'm truly shocked about given my behaviour. But that's life, I guess. I went through university on that kind of MDI process and kind of ignored the diabetes to some extent. I think my main thing was I didn't really blood test, but I did an awful lot of making sure I took insulin with food because I didn't really want to end up far too high. And then towards the end of the 90s, the beginning of the noughties, I finally moved on to the newer, faster-ish insulins and Lantus, on which I stayed for quite a long time, running through until the late 2010s. And then I kind of encountered doing more exercise more properly than I had done previously, and started to discover that if you take Lantus and you don't have very much body fat in certain areas, it acts like a fast-acting insulin, which was quite scary at the time because I was having massive hypos for no apparent reason. Soon after that, so this was about 2013, 2014, I got hold of Libre when it was first released in Europe. And that was kind of when Diabettech started, and when I properly got involved in diabetes technology and in talking about it. I've been a moderator on the diabetes.co.uk forum, which is pretty big in the UK. I don't know whether you guys have seen it in the rest of Europe and over in the US, but it has something like 250,000 to 400,000 people who participate in it. It's mostly people with type 2, but there is a significant type 1 community in there that don't generally participate in standard social media that we call social media, so things like Twitter and Facebook. And you'd see the same questions occur on Twitter and Facebook, in the groups that were around at that point in time, as well as in the diabetes.co.uk forum. And I got bored of copy pasting stuff, so I started writing it down on a website that people could then go to and start to. So instead of going, here, what about this? You go, have a read of this. I've written it once, then repeat. And so as the Libre came out, I started to notice the anomalies within it, i.e. the distance it was reading from what blood glucose things were testing. And I was quite lucky on one occasion where my reader broke. This is in the days before we had apps on phones to do this. And they sent me a spare one. So I had a sensor I've been wearing for like 2 days with a new reader and a new sensor, because it sent me a new sensor as well. And I was able to run a comparison of the two side by side. And what it showed was that actually the difference between the two sets of data was really quite significant. And kind of that was where I started to do the N=1 type observational studies to see what really happens. What if in the real world I'm doing something, does that really mean? So that's kind of when the CGM N=1 started, and when making adjustments to things and seeing how that data played out and capturing the data and using it to generate information came into play. And I've been doing that ever since on Diabettech. But I also in 2015, 2016 fell into the We Are Not Waiting community and discovered G5 and XTrip and the XTrip bridge, and built my first We Are Not Waiting piece of software. And then in 2016 built OpenAPS in the days where you couldn't just run a script to do it, or couldn't just build it in a nice easy way, and had to construct something that was based around bits of code that weren't easily linked. And that's where I started, and that's how I understood how the OpenAPS algorithm worked, was because of the things you had to do at that point in time. And since then, I've written about the updates in that, and I've talked to people about how they use the algorithm and how you can get the best out of it, and tried to give some of that back in that sense. And it's proven to be very interesting. And as a result, we've also managed to get poster presented up at ATTD this year, talking about what goes on in the We Are Not Waiting community, and specifically the types of N=1 patient research that should be paid attention to, and potentially have a leading view on what people are seeing and doing in the community.
We feel your journey. Some of us that have been on that journey.
Yeah, I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to talk about insulins, faster insulins and mixing insulins, because it's a topic that we do in the We Are Not Waiting community. It's something that we used to do when I was first diagnosed. And I'm sure some of you here remember mixing cloudy and clear insulins and the rules about doing that. But it's something that seems to have got lost in the mists of time. And if you read the packaging on most insulins now, they say, do not mix this insulin with anything else. This could be dangerous. And yet I've done it, and I know plenty of other people have, to try and mitigate the effects of the additives that have been put into some of the faster insulins that have now appeared on the market. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to have a chat about that. I've got a couple of pictures, first of all, to talk about why we might want to use faster insulins, and then we can discuss about how those work within the loops and what things we might need to consider about it. But then what we think the impact is of using faster insulins mixed with the slower ones, and how that plays out as a user of closed loop systems. So what we're looking at here is the insulin on board, sorry, not the insulin on board, the insulin activity curves for Humalog, Fiasp, and Lyumjev. And the reason for putting these up is to make very clear the differences between these insulins and what that means. As you can see, Humalog, for the same 1 unit of insulin at its peak, is has less activity than Fiasp, which is slightly faster and has more of its insulin effect early in its life, and then Lyumjev, which again is brought forward even more. Now, these don't 100% represent the curves that are provided in the various pack inserts that you'll get with insulin, but they are the approximations that are used in the DIY insulin curves that we have for Loop, OpenAPS, and Android APS. And it's worth commenting that all three of those systems generate their insulin curves starting from the same set of maths that was widely discussed in 2017-18 when Fiasp came onto the market, and was clearly quite different from the effects of Humalog and Novolog. So what you can see is that I've got the mouse out now so we can see that as well. Maybe we use the laser pointer because that can be more fun. But what you can see is that if this was 1 unit of insulin, we know that you have this massive fat tail in Humalog, which, as you can see from these other two curves, the orange being Fiasp and the grey being Lyumjev, are much reduced when you're using these newer insulins with the additives. So what that means is that for the DIY system that's using them, they are aware of the reduction in insulin on board, and that they are also aware of the effects that has when you need to give more insulin. Now, we know from the presentations that were given at ATTD that when they tried this with the 670G and with the T-Slim Control IQ, they didn't get that much difference in terms of the performance of the algorithms, because they weren't tuned around the variance in the different types of insulin and what that really means. So being able to tell a system about the different curves that are involved really does make a big difference to the performance of the algorithm. And I think, I don't know if you guys have seen it, the recent paper from a couple of German users that have moved to Lyumjev under Android APS, and as a result have got away with not bolusing anything for a month and not announcing any carbs for a month, and are getting a time in range of 90-odd%, which is quite incredible with these new insulins. But I guess equally alongside that is the question of what do we do about when we have issues. And I know Joe has had significant problems with Lyumjev, struggling with its side effects. And I know when I first started using it, I was having those issues. And so have a significant number of other people. And if you actually look at the Lyumjev pump research report, there were quite a significant number of people who raised issues compared to using compared to using Humalog. So we know it has issues, and that's why many of us started mixing, and we started mixing with Fiasp because Fiasp was causing us all sorts of problems, and then as we used it over a period of time, the performance got significantly worse. For me personally, as I started mixing it around 50% Humalog, 50% Fiasp, I found that I got an earlier peak, but I still had quite a long tail in using it, which isn't a massive surprise if you look at these two tails for Fiasp and Humalog. And effectively what I was getting was the Fiasp taking effect. So if I was to draw a line on this, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that here. So this might be a rubbish bit of drawing because I'm using a trackball to do it. But effectively what I was seeing was sort of for 1 unit of Fiasp Humalog mix, if you assume that this is 1 unit of Humalog and this is 1 unit of Fiasp, I was seeing a sort of a performance that kind of went like this, but then dropped off, a little bit like this. Which is fine. It's better than I was getting on Humalog alone, and it was stopping me from having the same issues with the Fiasp that I would have. I actually went back to Fiasp straight off, having used the mix, and it worked fine for about a week, and then it started to have problems again. So I think with the specific additives in Fiasp, for some of us, it just doesn't work properly. But what I've also found in running Fiasp and Lyumjev together is that effectively what I get is a much more something that goes kind of, forgive my terrible drawing, that does seem to match that kind of model, but it doesn't drop off like you might expect it to with the Fiasp, with the Lyumjev. I found it tended to be much more like the Fiasp line going down, so it would tend to pick up with the Fiasp line from there, which is better than it was with Humalog and Fiasp, but it still means that you've got quite a long tail involved. And those are some of the things you have to consider when you do use these mixes of insulins, that they're not always going to be perhaps quite as aligned with what the estimations are as they could be. So using these with a DIY system, I was running essentially a 3-peak curve where I'd set my mix on these two to 50 minutes, but I was leaving the tail at 7 hours because it's the only way that I could get it to work properly and not end up with late tail hypos as a result of it stacking too much insulin on top of each other. But I think what this demonstrates, and I posted an image of that combination on Twitter when this was being discussed at EASD last month. What I found was that moving from the mix of Humalog and Fiasp to the mix of Fiasp and Lyumjev created a significant improvement in my time in range. So it meant that my time in range went from around about an average of 85% to an average of about 90%, which is quite a big jump just by changing insulin and the speed at which it's active. And what it highlights is that when you move to faster insulins, what you're effectively doing is you're cutting off the high earlier when you're reacting to carbohydrate. And that makes a massive difference to the performance of the loops that know that this is going on and are able to compensate for these things. And to sort of go alongside that, if we move to the next slide, which is just isn't going to work. There we go. Just shows you the difference in insulin on board and the timings on that. And whilst it doesn't look a lot, if you look at the 200 minutes mark, or a little over 3 hours, you can see that at 3 hours, there's around about 18% of your Humalog still on board. Whereas with your Lyumjev, you're talking about probably less than 10%. So if you're somebody who does do things in the evening, also after a meal, if you do exercise, you should have much less to worry about the amount of a tail that is on board if you're just using MDI as standard than you would as a user of the Humalog. And that's why these types of insulin, faster in and faster out, are really quite important. They mean that your excess insulin as a result of dealing with food and dealing with stress should generally be slightly lower than it is when you're using the older, not quite so fast. And when we say not quite so fast, we mean really quite slow insulins that for a long time the healthcare profession has not really understood. But coming off the back of that, sort of opening up to the people on the call, I mean, how many of you are using faster insulins, and what has your experience been?
I'll tell you what, I can put up a poll, and I can tell you my experience with Fiasp was similar to yours. It worked for 6 months, and then it became very, very erratic. So I went back to Novolog, and then I snuck it back in, figuring maybe I could fool my body, and it worked for about 3 months. And then it started getting erratic, and now anytime I tried it, within 2 or 3 days, it would be erratic. I then tried Lyumjev, and honest to goodness, loved the effect.
Yeah.
Statistically, it probably wasn't entirely significant, but it made enough of a difference that I really wanted to stay on it, except for the horrific skin issues and the burning on even microboluses. It was constant, but I really wish it didn't hurt. I would have stayed on it, but I think it was damaging skin.
Because that's quite interesting, because well, as I mentioned, when I first started using it, I could feel that it wasn't comfortable and it was really quite difficult. But after running with it with Fiasp for a period where I didn't get any effect from either of the two, so by diluting both the additives in Fiasp and the additives in Lyumjev, I didn't seem to get the same site issues or the same burning and pain effects. Going back to the Lyumjev down the line, it no longer affects my sites, which is a little bit strange. But I don't know if Brad is joined this conversation. But I discussed with him a little bit about treprostinil, and I've also discussed it with a couple of other healthcare professionals. And I was made aware that treprostinil, when it's used with in its normal setting, usually causes some irritation at the site, and also takes some time to become accustomed to. So I wonder whether by diluting Lyumjev with treprostinil in it for a period, you can actually relieve the site concerns that come up. And then when you do move to 100% use of Lyumjev, that may go away. Now, I've tried it on myself, and that seems to have been what's happened, but I don't know of anybody else who's tried that yet.
I have not. I'm going to put out a poll, and people can feel free. But if you have answers to what Tim is asking, please throw it in the chat. Or at this point, if you'd like, you can unmute and add some feedback. They're quiet. They've been trained not to.
What's also interesting is looking at the chat that's going on with Katerina talking about free APS, and Christoph talking about using Android APS. This is where it gets quite interesting, not just in terms of the insulin, but also in terms of how the algorithms themselves look at what's going on in the body and how they determine what to do. because whilst free APS is based on loop but has the additional capabilities around the nonlinear carb absorption and obviously the ability to auto bolus with adjustable variations on that, the key thing that it doesn't have is the unannounced meal component of OREF1. And so why is that important? And that's important because it allows Android APS and OpenAPS to be more aggressive once it starts to see a certain type of deviation in the blood glucose levels compared with what it's expecting, which the underlying loop algorithm doesn't yet have as a piece of functionality. And that's why people who are using Android APS, which is obviously based on the OpenAPS algorithm, OREF1, are starting to be able to use Lyumjev with it and find that they're not seeing excessive high glucose levels post meals. It's purely because of that UAM component, which is what detects that meals have been eaten and what therefore allows it to deal with them. There was quite an interesting study published at ATTD this year, which came from one of the guys in the US, which put bog standard loop and bog standard Android APS onto pigs. And the whole intention of this was to compare what happens between the two algorithms when humans can't put any input into them. So the insulin curves were adjusted for how pigs absorb insulin, which is significantly more quickly than humans do. And then what the pigs were run with loop for a period, and then they were run with Android APS for a period. And I think the difference was that under standard loop, so this is without any autobolusing as well, to be clear, this is just with the temporary basal adjustment. Standard loop came out with around about 40% time in range, and Android APS managed to achieve 65% time in range. Now, why is that significant? Well, you don't have the capabilities within loop to deal with meals like you do in Android APS and OpenAPS. But secondly, without any real tuning, without any human interaction with the algorithm, Android APS was achieving 65% time in range, and 65% time in range equates to pretty much 7 to 7.5% HbA1c, and that's a level that around about only 30% of people ever achieve. So the algorithm behind OpenAPS and Android APS with no human interaction can still get you to a level of 65% time in range if you do nothing and if you're just using a standard insulin, which is quite fascinating in its own right. So if you then introduce these newer, faster insulins on something that's achieving that level of performance, you can understand why it might get more interesting.
I'm curious about the additives. I understand they use different additives, and I'm particularly interested in Lyumjev because it works so well. Are you aware of anything that's being done to mediate the skin reactions?
So this is one of those questions that is always very interesting because the number of people who are actually reporting skin reactions, and I think the same is true of Fiasp, isn't the majority of people. So what you find is that overall, it's a significant minority that have problems with these, or it's a significant minority that report them. But for many people, they just continue and carry on using an insulin that they end up with and potentially don't report it. So as long as there's not a majority of responses that say there's something wrong, people don't, well, the insulin companies don't have a reason to fix it, I guess, if you like. They will certainly look at it. I mean, if you look at the pump report, it does clearly state that there is an increase in early removal of sites, and that when they looked at it, they wanted to check whether what was causing that. But I don't see anything in what we're seeing come out of those companies that suggests they're looking at skin reactions as a particularly major issue in these insulins.
That's interesting because I reported it to my friends, but I didn't report it any place that might have had any impact.
And that's something I encourage everybody who gets these reactions to do. So in the UK, we report it to the MHRA. You guys report it to the FDA. Things only change with those manufacturers if enough people report it to the regulatory bodies.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think we talk amongst ourselves, but we don't always report. And that's a good reminder to all of us. Here in the US with the FDA, with COVID, they're very busy, but still report gives in and probably is entered into some sort of database, which would be helpful.
Absolutely.
What about using Lyumjev in an injection for a high?
So I've only tried it a couple of times as an injectable rather than in the pump. And I found it worked very quickly. I can't speak for others in that respect, and I'm not sure when you get high, if you have, I know that sometimes some people find that with Fiasp, when you get higher levels, it doesn't really work as efficiently. So I haven't tested it at that level with Lyumjev yet. What I've found, which has been quite interesting, is that using it in the pump with I use OpenAPS rather than Android APS because I've modified OpenAPS to allow me to allow it to be more aggressive than the standard algorithm is. And I can't write Java, so I can't do it in Android APS. I can write the scripts that OpenAPS are written in. What I found is that I'm not actually getting to levels where I need to apply it, which has been quite interesting in and of its own right. Would it cause issues? I honestly don't know. Would it be better or worse than other things? I say I haven't got any experience to be able to share on that.
Okay, there was an interesting question about slow carbs or slow progression in the stomach with slow digestion and fast insulin. If you're using fast insulin, would you use less of it?
So it's an interesting question, right? I mean, just give me a second, because what I can do, if I can find it, I can perhaps share it with you. So I have been, actually, that's actually a pretty good chart today. So today I have eaten basically a relatively low carb, pretty high protein. So let me just share this with you. Yeah, okay. So this is Lyumjev today working with a relatively high protein day and a relatively low carb day. But at this point here, where you can see a load of microboluses going in, and you can see that it's given significant basal there as well. That's how I've adjusted my algorithm, so I get more basal with microboluses. Is when I've just eaten some random crackers and cheese, and it's just carried on quite happily. It's a bit all over the place, unfortunately, as I'm sure you can see. But if we go to reports, ignoring some of the horrible lows in there, which are my own fault, this is a day where this period over breakfast, that 20 grams represents a very high protein breakfast. It's about 40 grams of protein. And what you can see it doing is leaving it's just microbolusing and keeping it in range as a result of that over the following, 4 or 5 hours. And that's pretty typical of what I've seen in terms of using Lyumjev. I think faster insulins lend themselves better to auto-bolusing platforms, because if you're eating slower carbs like pizza or slower food like pizza, you don't really want to be giving a big upfront injection or bolus of it, because it does take effect pretty rapidly. So you will drop low and then you will have to climb back out of it. Whereas what I've found has been working quite effectively for me is to give a 2 to 3 unit bolus with the meal, not even before the meal, and then leave the automatic bolusing to work throughout the meal as my glucose levels have told it I need to do that. And that's actually proven to be quite effective. It's really worked very well.
Okay, you were reminded not to excuse yourself for horrible lows because it was clearly
I know I'm excusing myself for them because they're all me doing things that really aren't recommended, like giving myself way too much insulin. But
oh, we all do that.
I know we do, and we all know we're not acting in a rational fashion when we do it as well.
That's right. Okay, so we're talking about insulins. Do you want to touch on Afrezza?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people have talked about in the past is using Afrezza with a looping system, and I've never written it up, but I've done it a couple of times where I've used Afrezza alongside OpenAPS. And the key thing that I would say about using Afrezza with OpenAPS, and it would be presumably the same with Loop. I mean, I've never tried it. Is that Afrezza is really quick in, really quick out. I mean, it's kind of maximum 10 minutes and it's having an effect. When I've used it with meals, I have to inhale it after the meal. I can't do it with the meal because the effect is just too quick for that. And what I've tended to do is inhale with the meal. Don't tell the looping system about the carbohydrate content because it doesn't need to know. And then leave the absorption model that the system has to account for the variances after that. And obviously with OpenAPS and Android APS, you've got this unannounced meal concept. So it's able to be a bit more aggressive about that and manage glucose levels post-meal more effectively. So it's quite an interesting combination. And if you've got access to Afrezza and you really want to use it, I think it's very, very quick. Very, very quick indeed. And the best bit about it is it gets out in about 2 hours. That's the other thing that's great, is the amount of time it stays in your body is really low compared to the injected insulins. You have to excuse me, I've been joined by the cat now, so she's decided she's making a bit of noise. Say hello to everybody.
Oh, what's your baby's name?
This one's Melanie. And you can see Samantha sitting on the bed behind me.
We've been watching her. So we're hearing the same thing. Don't put it in as insulin and it's in and out so fast. And very often we say, have it on hand at least for highs that won't come down. If you have a bad pump site, if you just totally miscalculated or the carbs weren't reported correctly, and just have it around. And there seems to be a lot of resistance in the US for insulin, for Afrezza to be covered by insurance.
Yeah, well, I think the main reason for that is Afrezza compared to, I mean, insulin in the US is expensive, right? I understand that, but as far as I can tell, Afrezza is more expensive than the other insulins when it's given to insurance, which I can't fathom. It's astonishing, really, that they're trying to charge more for it. But I know historically that's been the issue for insurance with Afrezza.
Are you surprised that there aren't more inhalable options?
No. The challenge with insulin is that it encourages cellular growth in the lungs when you inhale it. So you have to do it in a way that is totally passive and that there's no effect of the insulin on the lung cells. I can't remember the name of the insulin that was released in the mid-noughties, but it was found after 5 years of use to be causing cancer, which fundamentally is obviously a massive problem with lung cancer. So I think what mankind did with technospheres was fundamentally brilliant. I mean, it's a fascinating way of getting the insulin through the lungs. It's been around for long enough now that there are no reported cases of cancer coming from it, which has got to be a good thing, right? I mean, it's a really innovative way of delivering insulin. I personally find I can't do it for too long because it makes me cough, and I actually find it makes me end up with quite a productive cough, which I don't think is a good thing. But when I do use it, it's really, really fast. And the other thing I'd say is it seems to last for a long time, because I've got some that's well out of date and it still works without any issues at all.
I just saw a quote from their CEO that you can also freeze the cartridges that you're not using, which even extends it longer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There was a guy in Australia who trialed it many moons ago, and he buried some in a tropical glass house where the ground temperature was around 45 degrees, left it there for 6 months, then went and picked it up again and tested it, and it worked. I had no issues with it at all. It does seem that that constituent way of creating the inhalable does seem to provide quite a lot of protection for it as an insulin, unlike what we see with the injectables.
Do you have a sense of why it needs to be at room temperature?
Which one?
Afrezza?
I'm not sure it does. I think that's more to do with nobody's tested it outside of room temperature.
Okay, that probably makes a lot of sense. What about smart insulins? Not yet available, but do you have any?
Well, smart insulins and artificial pancreases have a huge amount in common. If you think about it, what you're doing with a smart insulin isn't that far removed from what you're doing with an artificial pancreas, but what you're doing it in is in the layering, or how it is you allow the insulin to be released in the injectable that you've created. So what you need is to allow no over-release of insulin when it's accessible, such that it will cause a hypo. And I know most of the smart insulins that they've talked about up until now work on the basis of when glucose levels reach a certain level, then you have a variable release over a glucose variable level. Below a certain level, it doesn't release anything, and above a certain level, 100% is released. So what they've got to figure out is an algorithm that is aligned to the, if you like, the container that does that. And one of the interesting questions is about how long does insulin really take to get out of the system in the body? Because the reality is you have to tune that really carefully to the half-life of insulin within the body, so that you can be sure you're not overdosing based on the variation in glucose and the speed at which glucose levels might be changing. So it's a really complicated problem to solve, because it's not just about the how you make it react. It's about when it reacts, what happens next, and how long do things last. And I think I remember reading somewhere, I think I wrote about it in the past, that insulin half-life in the body is about 8 minutes, or 8 to 10 minutes. So they've got to be quite careful about how much insulin they release as a result of that, because it would be relatively easy to overdo it. I know that Novo have talked about a phase 2 or phase 3 trial of the smart insulin that they picked up from one of the universities in the UK in the last couple of years. So we're expecting to see some level of report around that in the next 18 months or so, and that will be really interesting to see.
It's scary. It's a little
exactly.
bit scary.
Trust becomes the really interesting part of this, because essentially the challenge is about going from when you go have a sudden drop in glucose levels, how does it work with exercise? If you're currently at, let's say you're currently at 7, which is above the minimum level, and then you go and do a 10-mile run, what happens then? For the duration of that 10-mile run that you're above 6, let's say, is your threshold level, and it's delivering insulin, then you're going to have carbs, because there's nothing you can do about that. Mm-hmm. What about if you don't eat particularly high levels of carbs, but you've eaten protein and therefore you're slightly above that level? Again, it comes into play, but how do you then deal with it when the extra insulin, because you've got no way of reducing the amount of insulin before you do exercise, because you don't have that concept in a smart insulin, you can't raise your glucose levels to do exercise in any other way than by giving glucose.
Mhm.
And if you give glucose, then you make the smart insulin release more insulin. So the whole question around exercise becomes really quite interesting.
Right. Yes, it's we are complicated, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating feedback loop. That's I see another cat's joined us from Mark.
That's Willow.
Yeah, it's a fascinating feedback loop. It really is, and it makes the challenge for smart insulins that much more complicated. And I know Novo have been talking about icodec, which is the week-long insulin, and people have been talking about, well, would I want insulin on board for that long? What does that mean? How does that work? I can't adjust it, especially when I want to do exercise. But the same thing's true with smart insulins. How does the smart insulin know you want to do exercise? It doesn't.
Right. It's
So
not that smart. Yeah.
So you've got to take some of those things into account as well. So yeah, it's an interesting area. It has its challenges. I look forward to seeing how that plays out.
Absolutely. I know I'm running close on time, but I just have to ask you about CGM, because I always read what you write and your N of one on the technology. And we basically right now have 3 systems. I just read about a sweat related.
The watch.
Yes, but I can't get any data on it, and they will give you, if you fund it.
So Hella smartwatch, I know only as much as anybody else does, but I decided I would put a Kickstarter order in for it so that when it does become available, if it does get to me, if it does, I mean, I've decided that I'm prepared to lose the £180 that it costs rather than worry about it. So if it does turn out to be something that's real and that works, I'm going to test it. We'll see if it works. But do I think I'm actually going to receive one? At this stage, I'm still...
Yes, but you'll get an N95 mask anyway.
Well, lucky me. So I understand the idea behind it. Do I believe it'll ever materialize? Well, it's supposed to materialize by November this year. I think we're probably talking about November next year at best, but I think that's goodbye to the money. We'll see. So that's my view on Hella. But I think this year's been a bit disappointing on the CGM front, because back at the end of last year, there were 4 new CGMs that were supposed to be becoming available in the European market. Of those, only one has launched, and that's the Glucoman Day system. I've had pretty terrible results with it. I mean, it just doesn't work for me. I was talking to the company reps about it, and they said that it's a very interesting model they use, because unlike every other CGM system, apparently the way the app works is that it adjusts its calibration based on historic data from previous sensors. Now, we know from what we've seen with X-Strip and with calibrating the Libre on X-Strip, with X-Strip, that's a really bad idea, and with Libre, it's a really bad idea because of the variances between sensors. So X-Strip doesn't allow you to do that anymore. But Glucoman, apparently, the more you use the app and the sensors, the better its calibration becomes. Now, I've used it over 6 sensors, and as far as I can see, it's not improved at all over that time. So whether that's just me or whether that's the way the system works, I can't answer that question. I've had them tell me that there are plenty of very satisfied customers who used to use Libre. And I said to them, well, that's because they didn't have CGM before, isn't it? And they went, well, maybe. But for me, it wasn't a great experience. And I think the Libre 3 is probably the first commercial system that's really going to challenge Dexcom. And I think it's really going to challenge Dexcom. the experiences we've had with Libre 2, running it with a patch stack and then picking up the data in Android APS and in Xtrip, showed performance of what is essentially the same technology that was pretty much the equal of the Dexcom G6. So it's Libre 3. It's going to be very interesting. Going to be very interesting indeed. And I think the other piece of that is that the Dexcom announcement in July that they were pushing back the G7 with the statement that they wanted to make sure that they had capacity to replace G6 for every user of G6. That's interesting language to use because it on one hand suggests supply chain problems, and on the other hand, it makes you wonder whether their testing of it is perhaps not going as well as they might have liked. But I mean, that's me being a cynic in this kind of realm and thinking maybe it's not going as well as they would like to talk about.
They also said that on the G6, they would not release it to certain groups until they felt they had enough in the supply. And I think part of it was they were getting an awful lot of early sensors returned.
Yeah, well, I mean, the G7, they've not even got to that point yet. So to push it back from a late 2020 release to at some point in the future without a date is quite a substantial change.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So I was on the original Abbott Navigator, loved it.
Well, the technology in Libre is not that different.
Interesting. And their pricing is very interesting. You've just been called Detective Tim Street. So I thought I would let you know that. I think
all this information is publicly available. You just need to know where to look. I mean, it's kind of like when they release new pumps, when they release new connected devices. But before you can get a connected device released in the US, and before it even goes to the FDA, the FCC has to approve the radio communications. And when they want to approve the radio communications, they require a copy of the user manual to be provided to the FCC. So if you go and look on the FCC website in their database, and you've got an inkling of what something's called, you can find the user manuals for half these things that haven't been released yet. I mean, that's what happened with things like the Roche Solo pump. They had the user manual for the Roche Solo pump on the FCC website in 2017 before it was released in Europe last year.
Got it. Interesting. I'm going to wind you down and say, oh my gosh, thank you. You know, I've been trying to get you to come talk for a while. Yeah. I know you're a busy man. I appreciate it. Please feel free to stay with us for the second half of this presentation. And if there are further questions that come up on SoCal Loopers, I will send them over to you.
I'm sure Bastian and Katerina are both going to give you a fascinating talk now as well.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I hope you have the rest of your evening, which is almost over, very pleasant. Thank you for letting us meet your kitties, and we'll talk soon.